Hi guys. So a big realization for me came when I deeply understood that there's evil in this world. Because for a long time, I didn't want to accept that. I used to say stuff like, do you think the devil is running around in Guatemala and influencing people there? I'm not sure why I say Guatemala. I know now that it was pretty dumb for me to say that. But I used to say that. So I didn't acknowledge that there's evil outside of me because I didn't have to acknowledge it in myself then, right? So there's no self-development anymore in that department because if I didn't even acknowledge it's in myself, it's non-existent, right? Because there's a saying out there that says the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing that the world, that he didn't exist in the world. Or so like the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist, right? I think the Usual Suspects movie said that. So it's hard to admit that we ourselves have evil in us, right? It makes you cringe a little bit. And I know how you feel, right? I've been there. But just like I learned math or science or art, I learn about evil, right? And evil sometimes wins. Actually, that's not entirely true. Sometimes evil loses. It's just that evil seems to have a much better marketing, right? And there's a Romanian philosopher, his name is Emil Cioran, and he spent much of his life observing humanity and arriving at some conclusions that make like a Monday rainy day seem optimistic, right? While most philosophers ask how can we live a better life, Cioran seemed more interested in asking, have you noticed how absurd all of this is? And when he looked at history, he noticed something uncomfortable. The people who conquer and dominate and manipulate and deceive often leave the biggest footprints, right? Right? You know that. Like these people that are kind and humble and decent, they're usually busy helping their neighbors and forget to build empires, right? Because history books are filled with generals and tyrants and conquerors and revolutionaries. You know, we name airports after powerful people. We build statues, you know, of winners, right? Nobody erects monuments to like Steve, who was very consistent and very considerate from 1987 to 2026, right? So Cioran saw this and concluded that there is something fundamentally skewed about human affairs, right? Energy, ambition, and certainty often belong to people who should probably have less of that, right? Some of you know these people. I know some of these people. So meanwhile, thoughtful people that are busy questioning themselves are not getting what they deserve, right? The dangerous person says, I know exactly what must be done here. And the wise person says, well, you know, it depends, right? Guess which one gets elected? You tell me. Because here's where Cioran becomes very interesting. He wasn't telling us to become evil. He was pointing out the paradox. If you need a certain amount of illusion and confidence and self-deception to succeed, right? Then the most honest people begin the race with the handicapped, right? The ruthless move quickly because they aren't burdened by all this rationale. They aren't burdened by doubt. The reflective move slowly because they care, right? They're burdened by reality, right? And yet, despite all of this, hopefully goodness persists. People still fall in love, they still care for aging parents, they still have amazing families, they still comfort strangers, they still perform acts of kindness, right? That those things don't make headlines. If evil truly won every time, civilization would have collapsed thousands of years ago. The real lesson from Choran isn't that evil always wins, is that goodness survives despite having no obvious reasons to, despite history, despite disappointment, despite evidence, despite social media, especially despite social media, right? Because it's a miracle, right? Not all good triumphs over evil in some grand Hollywood finale, but that ordinary decency keeps showing up every morning, refusing to disappear. So Choran forces us to look directly at the darkness, not because he wants us to surrender to it, but because illusions are very fragile. And hope that survives this reality, right? Because we should be stronger than hope that depends on fantasy. So now I know that evil exists, but I don't know for sure if evil is winning, right? Some days it certainly feels like that. But the fact that we still ask whether goodness matters suggests that evil hasn't achieved 100% victory, right? After all, if it had, none of us would question this. So evil is everywhere, just like love is everywhere. We should know that so we can be aware of the fact that it exists, so we can be better, right? So we can work on that. And with that, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, and don't kill any insects today. Mwah, 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 mwah.